Introduction. Concoction. One of the more common questions that late diagnosed autistic people have is, why did no one notice that I was autistic before? How have I gone this amount of time in my life being undiagnosed, not being picked up as being autistic? Well, today we have a video from the awesome and amazing channel Autistimatic, which I highly recommend going and checking out. In the description of this video, there's always a link at the bottom. Go check out the original content, give it a like, give it a subscribe, all of that stuff. One thing that I like is these disclaimers at the start of the video.
Why did it take you so long to find out you're autistic? Why didn't anyone spot it years ago? When adults finally learn that we're autistic, it's often the first thing we ask. We read through the diagnostic report and it all seems so obvious. So why didn't someone just tell us? Things could have been so different. I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic.
Hello, Quinn.
And today on Autistic, we're asking, why didn't anyone notice you were autistic before?
Yeah, I suppose it's kind of crazy to think about, like, how many situations that people can be in throughout their life around teachers and their parents and other parents and people that they meet, where, like, nobody has pointed out the potential that they could be autistic. Do you know what I mean? Like, just for example, with the rates of, like, mental health amongst just autistic people in general, we're obviously going to be more likely to be in, like, a therapist's office or go to a doctor to try and figure out our own sort of mental states more than the average person. So it's very confusing that people do not pick up on it. And, like, I've heard from a lot of people that and seen that autism does very frequently get misdiagnosed as other stuff, particularly related to BPD and bipolar, even schizophrenia. I've heard from some people. I mean, the original origins of sort of autism, I think there was this Russian psychologist called Sukureva who basically characterized autism as being like an infantile, like schizophrenia-like thing. Correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I think I remember it that way. Also, awesome animations. I love it. Love it.
If you don't know me already, I'm Quinn, and I've known I'm autistic for 40 years. When I received my diagnosis, the world had barely even heard of autism, and the spectrum was still a promising but untested theory. It was simply impossible for an ordinary person like you or me to self-identify back then. Until about a decade ago, most of the autistic people I met were younger than me. Not everyone, but the majority by some measure.
Yes.
But since then, the autistic demographic has changed massively. The reasons behind that shift are no mystery, though. The autism spectrum wasn't formalised in print by the World Health Organization until 1992, and 2 years later it was adopted in America too. The very first autism spectrum diagnosis based on DSM criteria in the United States was only 30 years ago. Since then,
So Quinn is an OG. I wonder what age they got diagnosed, because they said that it was 40 years. I'm definitely going to have to ask him when I have a chat with him tomorrow. But yeah, I mean, there's more people than ever having, like, awareness of autism as a thing. Like, the growing autistic communities have started to have a little bit more outreach to mainstream individuals. And so a lot of people who have been undiagnosed for, like, a large portion of their life are now becoming late diagnosed autistic. It must be quite difficult, like, not being able to find somebody who kind of, I guess, you can relate to in that way. Because I imagine if you're meeting lots of people who are younger than you can relate to them on the autism front, but, like, just from what I've heard from late diagnosed autistic people, like, the way that, like, people treated you in the school system and stuff was wildly quite different. 30 years is such a short time. I think he said 40 years. 1984, did he say? I think that's what he said. I just turned 18 in 1992 when diagnosis was just going mainstream. Interesting. I think he's about 54. So age 14? Wow.
The most likely path to receiving an autism diagnosis has always been found within our education systems, which kind of makes sense, really. Much of what autistic people find most disabling and other people see as frustrating about us centre around social interaction and communication.
Yes.
For many of us, school is our first introduction to mixing with large groups of strangers and of strict, rules-based hierarchy. So it's not just possible, but likely that autistic kids might start to show signs of stress in school that weren't noticed before.
No, for sure. I remember the thing that my mum talks about the most about me entering into mainstream school is that before I went to school, I was really, really interested in reading and maths and learning. As soon as she put me into primary school in the UK, which I can't remember what the translation is to American schools, but the first sort of school level that wasn't nursery, like when I was a little kid. And my skills, my attention, my behavior just changed completely. And she thinks that it's related to the differences in the sensory and sort of social environments particularly. So it makes sense. You're also around people who you don't particularly understand. And, you know, if you don't know that you're different sort of during that time, which I didn't in primary school, to be honest, up until a certain point, it can be sometimes quite difficult. It can produce a lot of anxiety, you know, difficulties with behaviour and such in response to that.
If you left the school system before the autism spectrum went mainstream, then your chances of being spotted as possibly autistic were vanishingly small.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes,
especially if
there
you're
were
a woman.
Test cases along the way like myself, so-called troublemakers and misfits who received preliminary diagnoses in the 80s from practitioners with their eyes on the future.
Mm-hmm.
Those provisional statements built the foundation of proof for the adoption of the spectrum later on. But nobody actually knows how many of us there were in that decade or so from initial paper to worldwide formal recognition. It was only in the thousands at most, unlike the millions of us we know about today.
Well, if it's one in 33, that's like a lot of people, and that's like just taking into account the diagnosis at the moment, not necessarily like all the undiagnosed autistic people that are out there. You know, it's crazy to think. My mum was told I was just a nervous child. I used to be a bit of a class clown at school. It was mostly because I found that there was a one-to-one relationship with me being silly and getting a positive social reaction from my classmates. And that's basically how I got positive social interaction for a long time. Hi, Sarah, no problem.
When the spectrum was adopted by the WHO in 1992, the minimum school leaving age in the UK was 16. And staying on to further education wasn't as common as it would become later. If you were born before 1976, that's people currently about 48 years or older, you had no realistic chance of receiving an autism diagnosis in your school days. 48 years old. How many teenagers and young adults watching this now have parents that age? And older folks, of course. We're talking about plenty of grandparents and great-grandparents here now too.
Yep.
The main reason someone might have slipped through the net might just be their age.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone over 40, and especially those of us over 50, had such a low chance of being diagnosed with a condition that nobody had heard of or was really new at the time, that age definitely played a part in why we weren't identified as autistic sooner.
I think it's like a lot of people, a lot of sort of the elderly individuals who have got late diagnosed. Not necessarily saying that Quinn is elderly, but, you know, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it seems to be that a lot of people who are late diagnosed, from what I see, either get to a point sort of in the world where they are very much used to masking, and as that being like their main way of sort of interacting with the world, to a point where it's very, very difficult to change in that sense, or it takes quite a while, or they've made so many adjustments to their life in like what they do in terms of work, what they do in terms of their social life. They might have quite a minimal sort of small social bubble. It tends to be one of the two from what I've seen. I'd say that probably my granddad, you know, one of my granddads, very, very strong example of someone who has masked the pretty much their entire life. Obviously, like, not diagnosed autistic, you know, I can't know for certain, but it's definitely quite clear to me that there is some kind of like autism running through the family from that side. But no, for sure, such a revelation. Let me tell you, I can try to imagine. You know, I was diagnosed when I was 10 years old. I'm 27 at the moment. Must be absolutely mind blowing for so many people. I'm just going to adjust this because it seems like my thingy's doing something weird. Let's continue.
There's been a huge increase in autistic people in my age group, Gen Xers and our baby boomer parents. But what about all the undiagnosed millennials coming to light now? What about all those in their 20s, 30s and early 40s who are finding out they're autistic? What else should we be looking at? When I first heard the word autism, I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. It was a piece on children's TV and about an American savant boy described as a human calculator. That was all I heard.
No way. The human calculator. I don't know if that's like a pleasant or... I mean, it's obviously like a media sort of hyped related thing. It's kind of strange, but I don't know. Is that a compliment? I don't think it is. The human calculator.
Heard of
I am definitely not a human calculator, that's for sure.
Autism until I was told I was autistic myself a few years later. But for millennials, things were a bit different. And the turning point, from my perspective, has always been in plain sight. The worldwide success of the movie Rain Man in 1989 turned autism from a little-known, obscure condition few people had heard of into a global talking point.
Yes.
When the autism spectrum hit the diagnostic manuals a couple of years later, autism yet again became a hot topic of conversation.
I think as well as this illuminating autism to a lot of people, it's still not ideal ratio. Let me sort this out. Let's cut off some of the... There we go. Yeah, I don't think it's ideal because although people have come across the idea of autism now, more people know the term and know perhaps some of the things related to it. Is also provided quite a lot of misinformation, which is talked about quite a lot. You love that movie, Mean Machine? To be honest, like when I watched it, I did actually quite enjoy it. I watched it probably when I was a teen, you know, sort of tween age. I did quite like it. I thought it was a good story, but also, you know, as I've got older and as I've learned about like the different sort of perceptions of that film from other people, you know, it's debatable, isn't it? The positive versus negative impact of a film like that. It's definitely like very negative in a lot of different ways for like social perception of autism, but also, you know, it's sort of paved the way for a public interest in autism, mainstream interest, in a sense. Well, hardly anyone would identify with that yet. I wish all autism came with a savant option. Well, as savant's not just like the characterization of savant, like there's very, very minimal, very small amount of people. And it usually is people with very, very high support needs who have one particular thing that they are absolutely exceptional at when in comparison to their other skills, like an extreme spiky profile, in a sense. The character was based on a guy who was a savant, but said he was not autistic as far as I can remember. Yeah. I think that's one of the issues, isn't it? It's just I think it was incorrect. It was an incorrect representation, and it was also, even if it was correct, it's a very sort of rare thing related to it, you know. Not
very informed conversation, though.
No.
For salty old autistic dogs like me, our introductions to new people went from spelling out the word autism and explaining the basics to battling a rising tide of unhelpful ideas and scary misconceptions about who and what we are.
Yes.
This was the era that saw the rise of Autism Speaks. Andrew Wakefield...
People showing throwing chopsticks at us. Wait, no, the little toothpicks on the ground just to see if we'll be able to pick them up.
Field's destructive nonsense about vaccines and plenty of reductive theories that set the stage for many of the struggles we wrestle with now.
The old Andrew Wakefield vaccine myth, god damn it, it still has its impacts in our society till this day. Not even talking about the Speaks related stuff. Jeez.
We went from nobody knowing autism existed to a planet full of armchair experts.
Yep.
You know how during big sporting tournaments, you see all these folks who showed no interest in the game before suddenly coming out of the woodwork like they know it all. They've not paid the slightest notice before, but as soon as the national team's doing well, they're all over it like a rash. That's kind of what it felt like, and still does to some extent.
That's the effect, isn't it? I can't remember what the exact psychological effect is called. It might be called like the Dunning-Kruger effect. Maybe I'm thinking of something else. Basically, people who get into a hobby sort of overestimate how much they know about the actual topic or hobby or thing that they're talking about. And as they learn more, they underestimate how much they know about the topic or are more sort of aware of how much they know about the topic. Herd effect. I think that's definitely Dunning-Kruger. Yeah.
It has got better, don't get me wrong, but the biggest barrier to being identified as autistic is people simply not knowing what autism looks like.
Yep.
Even now, public understanding of autism and even neurodiversity is a long way behind the curve.
Yeah, people are aware of autism. They don't understand it. That's the issue. We have this wave within the social media community of basically rejecting this idea of autism acceptance, but not rejecting it, but wanting to replace it with this autism acceptance. But I don't think we're getting to with quite at the point at which we need to focus on acceptance. Like, obviously it's important, but I think we need to help people understand. I think autism understanding is very key in the equation of getting people to accept it, or because as much as the social related stuff is important, people sort of accepting the way that we are and respecting us and stuff. There is so many inequalities which still exist around autism that need to be fixed, and I think a lot of that is due to an incorrect understanding of what autism is, for sure. So many people don't want to learn about it because it doesn't affect them directly, or they ignore their own autism. Yes, yeah. People don't have a vested interest in it, whereas if you come across a post on social media talking about autism, like come across an autism short by Thomas Henley, you may be more likely to listen to it if you have a cousin who has a kid with autism, or you have a friend who's autistic. Whereas if you're just a lay individual, you'll just be like, autism, I don't really want to, just scroll past it, something more interesting, for sure.
Before 1992, there was no autism spectrum, at least not on paper. And it took a decade or so for the message to filter through to ground level, to parents, teachers, GPs, health visitors, social workers, and all the other experts and key personnel you'd expect to be on the ball about something like this.
Yeah.
This was a monumental shift in establishment thinking that took a long time to permeate down through the layers of bureaucracy, best practice, staff training, budget restrictions, and individual apathy to start having a significant impact, and it's a process that continues today. When the diagnostic manuals incorporated the autism spectrum, they also introduced the new diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. A few years later, when the next editions came out, it was gone, superseded, and no.
Yeah, they added some other stuff like child disintegrative disorder, PDD, NOS, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, I believe, Asperger's, classic autism. I can't remember if it's classical or classic. And of course, the old Asperger's, which is what I was diagnosed with.
Longer to be diagnosed. We're still living with the confusion that caused and the internet arguments it fuels to this day. In the 40 years since I was diagnosed, when refrigerator mothers were still being seriously discussed, we've seen numerous theories come and go.
I'm glad that they brought up stuff like refrigerator mother hypothesis, because I think we like to, a lot of us like to focus on, I suppose, the difficulties and misconceptions about autistic people, but there have also been a lot of misconceptions about autistic, parents of autistic people too. One of which being the refrigerator mother, which is basically autistic children are sort of, through their development, exposed to cold parenting, cold refrigerator mother parenting, leading to the development of autism, which, lack of, loving physical contact and communication and things of that nature, which is complete balls. It's a developmental, classified as a developmental condition. You're born autistic. But that was a pretty widespread myth. And I can imagine still goes around to this day. I've actually talked to someone who, when I was having a conversation with them about autism, saying that, sometimes it can be caused by the parents as well. I'm like, no. I mean, maybe the genetics of the parents, but not by their parenting style, that's for sure. Parents of autistic people are likely autistic themselves, or at least some amount neurodivergent, for sure. Definitely something that makes sense based from the stats, but also, like, through my life, I meet an autistic person, I meet their parents, I'm like, or even ADHD,
Amongst those to fall from being the dog's danglies down to dog dirt are hypermasculinity and empathic deficit.
Ooh,
and that's just from one prominent,
hypermasculinity.
respected name in the field, let alone the cranks.
They're from Simon.
We've also seen a huge rise in autistic people seeking to understand ourselves from within. Not only enthusiastic amateurs like me, but people who've dedicated their academic careers to working these things out scientifically and provably. It does seem like every time we point out how things look different to us than they do to our often critical non-autistic observers, that we confuse and sometimes enrage them further. Every move towards clarity for us seems to muddy the waters for everyone else, and so the lack of clarity persists.
Yeah.
Number 2 then on our list of why weren't you spotted candidates is good old-fashioned ignorance.
Yes. And I would like to highlight not necessarily deliberate, intentional ignorance. That's kind of the emotion that the word ignorance sort of brings up. It's like someone's choosing to ignore it, choosing to ignore autistic experience and such. But I think a lot of it, in general, from most people that I meet, is unintentional ignorance. They're just not kind of exposed to it, or they have just been exposed to kind of mainstream portrayals of autism that aren't necessarily very applicable or informative in a lot of different ways. 100%. Ignorance is a massive one, for sure. And also, conflicting information, I would say, under that. Depending on who you talk to, where you go, what kind of communities you surround yourself in, you're going to get a range of different perspectives on different autism-related things.
I sometimes surprise people when I say that there was no toxicity about autism until people knew what it was. That didn't mean autistic people weren't having a bloody hard time all over the world, though, and perhaps that's where some of the surprise comes from. It's difficult to imagine a time when the word autistic didn't carry some unwanted, unpleasant baggage with it, but there was a short window of blissful innocence after I got my diagnosis, when I could say autism or autistic and receive nothing but blank looks.
Yes.
That changed very quickly after Rain Man hit the screens. They say a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and in my world there's little better illustration of that than the way public attitudes about autism appeared out of nowhere in the early 90s and then seemed to get stuck in a loop for 30 years.
Yeah, the people getting upset. Oh, what's causing it? This horrible thing. Is my child I need to fix this. Here are the parenting styles, new diet-related things, sort of devices that help treat autism. Jesus Christ. It kicked off a whole thing, Just like, I'd say as well, the little knowledge, but also the negative emotion that that can bring to someone. What would you say? The emotional reaction, the impression that it can leave on people, for sure. And then you get told that your kid could be autistic. You have that already sort of negative impression. Yeah, it can cause a lot of anxiety for people, especially if they don't know much about autism. They just have seen Rain Man, or just have a little bit of knowledge from some show that they've watched. People can get very worried.
The third of the big reasons behind why someone might get to adulthood without knowing they're autistic is, in a weird way, kindness. But it's a kindness born of stigma. I've told the tale many times of how I stopped telling people I was autistic after Rain Man came out. It was common knowledge even then that the autistic character in the movie was based on someone who wasn't actually autistic themselves. But bitter experience taught me that nobody's really interested in that little nugget of cinema trivia. A couple of weeks ago, a commentator on my Is Your Best Friend Autistic video talked of how they and their best friend used to call each other autistic as a tease. A bantery insult. They both believed themselves to be neurotypical at the time, but now at least one of them is knowingly actually autistic, possibly both of them. Their attitudes and understanding have obviously changed since then, but just take a moment to think about that. Autistic people using the word autistic as a slur before later finding out they're autistic themselves.
You know, that's a very good point. It's not something that I've thought of. You know, I see a lot of memes even nowadays. Like I imagine that they're talking about sort of a prior sort of past experience, but you know, even nowadays you see memes related to autism or, you know, touch of tism or like acoustic. Like it makes me think, you know, maybe, you know, the people who make that, or maybe the people who share it, or maybe the actual individuals are autistic themselves, but it's kind of this dismiss. I don't know. They're touching on it in a humorous sense, but they're not really sort of digesting it. I guess the fact that they could be autistic, rather. Does that making sense? Am I making sense? People fear what they don't understand. This is a very meta situation. Yes, it is. The anti-vaxxers insane. I saw that as someone who was damaged by a tainted vaccine as a child. Didn't make me autistic. It did cause seizures. I'm sorry to hear that, Eagle. That's awful. Miss Pat says, I was told by a psychiatrist once that I couldn't have had ADHD because I graduated from college. Fortunately, he was too incompetent to meet with me more than once, kept cancelling appointments. That's another interesting piece of the puzzle, you know, why people haven't realised that you are autistic, specifically parents. You know, in that situation, maybe that individual does have some executive functioning difficulties. Miss Fat, or they could do, you know. I think one of the problems is, you know, when people are confronted with the idea of autism, or like one of their kids gets diagnosed autistic, or someone tells them that they have some autistic traits, the traits that they're talking about are already things that they have integrated into their view of what it is like to be human, not necessarily be an autistic human. So they could be autistic, but because they think of the autistic experience as being the human experience, they find it quite hard in that sense. Or perhaps they ascribe certain autism-related stuff, traits, things of that nature, as being part of your personality. And so, you know, re-understanding those parts of who you are as being like an autistic trait can be quite difficult for some people. Parents want to deny my child's autistic. No. Well, no, I mean, it brings up a lot of negative reactions for people, especially if they have a bad impression of what autism sort of means for their kids. You know, there can be a lot of fear, and I do understand that for sure. You know, I mean, if you don't know about something, and someone you just know a little bit, and you think that it's negative, and someone tells you that your child is autistic or could be autistic, you're obviously going to have a negative reaction about it until you really sort of understand what that means, you know. But some people don't get to the point where they understand what that means, and they sort of do the digging, they understand the different aspects of it, you know, change their perception on it. Some people just get stuck at the, okay, my child's autistic, I need to fix this kind of stage, for sure. My mother doesn't want to know about it, I get gaslit. I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, and then I mean, don't get me wrong, like the amount of responses out there to autism-related media are starting to accrue, you know, as the autistic community becomes larger, more mainstream individuals are getting exposed to autistic creators. You know, there's obviously going to be some kind of backlash, some kind of questioning, some kind of like, maybe combativeness, a contrary position in the social media spaces, which is starting to become a lot more apparent to me, for sure. It's something that I thought would happen, and I have been saying for quite a while, but it's starting, you know. There's more detractors, more people criticizing the movements and, you know, autistic creators and such.
It's not the only time I've heard such a tale either. Some of us had a very poor, sometimes quite disturbing view of autistic people before we knew we were in the neurodivergent club ourselves. Recently, we've seen the media and the general public persistently trying to link autism with the ills of society. Every senseless murder and mass shooting sees the papers speculating about autism before they even know the killer's identity. Celebrities and politicians make headlines.
I think that there are also quite a few people who are diagnosed autistic who do that stuff. I think that's one thing that I try to talk about quite a bit. You know, autism is not necessarily linked to morality, and you know, quite a lot of the time we do experience a lot of difficult things with other people, you know, That can harbour a lot of resentment in some people who, may take that out on others. I think that there is the potential for that, of course, but, you've always got to factor in that autism is a part of who someone is, but it's not everything, Everyone's got different personalities, values, upbringings, experiences, for sure. Thomas, you consider doing a meetup or a convention of sorts? Possibly when I get a little bit bigger. I can get like a good amount of, if I can afford to like hire a venue or something, that would be cool.
Is by linking us with everything from sexual deviance to violence against women, then painting us as innocent, impressionable victims of evil agendas when it suits their purposes. The general public still don't know what to do with autism, and so they often just take the path of least resistance and minimal effort. They just listen to what the media tells them, to what their favourite celebrities think, to the news, to bloggers, and sometimes to YouTubers like me. But they also listen to Mickey down the pub, Maureen in the hair salon, and
Mickey down the pub. Autism is linked to the chemicals in Silicon Valley's water supply. I've heard that it's caused by refrigerator mothers. Did you know it's linked to drinking Bud Light? God damn it! Or what is that thing that we watched recently? The aspartame. It's linked to aspartame consumption. Did you have Diet Coke during your pregnancy?
Mrs. McCluskey, the head teacher.
Yeah.
All of them have their own input and opinions, and people are rarely kind about us as a demographic.
No.
The general public's perception of what it means to be autistic is not a positive one, and that's why not diagnosing us or telling us is seen as a kindness. They don't want to saddle us with the consequences of the ignorance we've been talking about and the stink of an unwanted diagnosis that may see us judged unfairly.
Yeah. I think that's one of the issues that I have with, because I really want to point out stuff and I really want to educate people about autism, and that extends also to my personal life. But I've always got to make sure, I've got to tread a thin line because, people do have negative perceptions of autism. And although I don't have a negative perception of autism in that fashion, it doesn't quite remove the negative impact that it can have on my relationship with that person. They can get very upset if I was to say, they show a lot of traits of autism, and if they've asked me, so I've always got to be careful about stuff like that, for sure. That's one of the issues that a lot of partners of undiagnosed autistic people can have. It's like, you go to them saying, I understand autism and I've been listening to this person and I think you might be autistic, and they think you're wrong. You're broken in these ways. That's what they interpret it as. Well, you're trying to psychologize me, I mean, I'm not going to lie. I think some people can do that, but you understand what I mean, hopefully.
Historically, we're not just talking about borderline cases either.
Yeah.
I know people who barely spoke as kids and had frequent explosive meltdowns who were bypassed for diagnosis because a practitioner or sometimes a parent decided that an autism diagnosis was a cross they didn't want them to bear.
Yes.
One
100%.
can understand the reasoning and perhaps forgive their motives, but we also know how what they did just perpetuates the same stigma it seeks to avoid.
Yeah.
The only way I can see to make our lives easier in the long run is to fix the very issues we've talked about today. There may be a better chance of identification today, better public knowledge, and less of a stigma than a few years ago for some of us, but plenty of autists still slip through the net. There's other factors at play, of course, like individual masking, co-occurring conditions and the like, but those are personal attributes or learned skills that vary from person to person. Every autist who wasn't identified until adulthood can look to at least one of these three factors as being a big contributor. We can't turn back time, so there's nothing we can do about number one on the list. But the other two, ignorance and stigma, are within our grasp.
Yes.
And the main thing it takes is exercising that very autistic trait of talking about ourselves. Not everyone is best placed to get the message across, we know that. But those of us who are good communicators or whose social masking skills give us opportunities to be listened to can make a difference. We already are. Thanks to this channel, I've been privileged to talk directly to researchers and practicing psychologists and psychiatrists to help them shape the future of autism discourse and diagnosis. Numerous other creators and thinkers have done the same, even collaborating on or writing research papers of their own. All the blogs, the vlogs, the podcasts, and epic social media threads my colleagues in advocacy write reach someone new every time. But most...
Go check out the podcast that I had with Sam Baron-Cohen, Temple Grandin. Really, really good interviews.
Of us have an impact even if we don't realise. On the ground level. It's that ground level, grassroots interaction that matters most because it's ordinary people who actually make the difference in our daily lives.
Yes. 100%.
Once all the Mickeys, the Maureen's and the Mrs. McCluskeys know what autism really is and that it's nothing to be scared of, the ignorance and the stigma that's blighted our lives will fade away.
Hopefully.
When that happens, no autist will go unnoticed again.
No. And you may not change people's minds on the spot, you know. And I'd say in a lot of cases, if people are very, very diligently like, no, this is wrong, you know, it's probably not worth the effort on your part, to be honest. But if they come across maybe yourself and then they see something on social media, they might be like, oh, you know, I heard someone who's talking about something similarly about autism, maybe I'll have a look into it, you know. I think just a little bit can be quite impactful, especially like in your local community, for sure. Love the Grange Hill reference. On this video, most were friendly, not all, but most. But some tracked me down and started posting nasty harassment on my stuff. Oh. Harriet says, my stimming and social communication difficulties were blamed on my visual impairment. When I was young, despite my traits being absent from my visually impaired friends. Yeah, that's another, I think, you know, a potential as well, like having other differences, you know, hearing differences, sight differences and such, other diagnoses, perhaps ADHD even, you know, people might go, oh, okay, they're ADHD and that's the reason why they are different. Don't sort of pursue the autism side of it. Could definitely be a part of it. I don't think ADHD is as negatively or has been as negatively stigmatized. It's strange looking at sort of the differences in the perceptions and how people talk about autism and ADHD, whilst both of them being sort of inherent neurodivergencies. I think it can, you know, the perception of it is very different. You know, ADHD is more often than not talked about in terms of how to sort of correct and sort of fix, or, you know, stuff related to life, you know, because it's a lot to do with like concentration and, you know, that's usually that's why it was, you know, diagnosed a lot. Hyperactivity, stuff like that. It's very interesting to like see how different creators speak about ADHD versus autism. It's quite interesting. Never understood what's wrong with having multiple things going on. No, of course. For sure. I mean, there's a very heavy crossover between autism and ADHD anyway, you know.
I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic.
Hi,
Thank
Quinn.
you for watching. If you've already liked and subscribed and would like to support the channel more, then please follow the Patreon links in the description to pledge what you feel is fair and affordable to help keep the lights on here and the content keep flowing.
Yes, please do. Please go check out Quinn's stuff. The link to this video will be down in the description as per usual. Please go ahead, go over to the channel, give them a subscribe, like this video and their video, 100%. It really does help them out. Maybe drop them a comment, say that I sent you, and, you know, we've got to support all the people within the Autisverse. And much appreciated to Quinn for giving me permission to check out this video. I really like this one. I feel like it's like a proper YouTube video. I can tell that a lot of time has been taken to sort of script this out, and I really appreciate sort of the different perspective that Quinn offers in this video, for sure. And if you have enjoyed this and you want to see some more stuff from me, please make sure to like, subscribe, and perhaps go over to Thomas Henley, my main sort of channel where I make original videos and such. And you can become a member on there for as little as £1, which is around $1.34 per month. Really does help me out as a small creator trying to make it in the big world. And you'll be able to catch the uncut live streams over on there as well. You will get access to about a year's worth of uncut live streams with a membership, and it really does help me out a ton. I have a couple of new tattoos. It's like a double band. It looks like tape. It's like I've got tape on my arm. I was thinking insulating tape. Yeah, it's because it's so fresh. It's so fresh and clean. Like, it's like I've got tape on my arm. Someone asked me, like, am I recovering from an injury? You can see, like, the little hairs poking through, sort of, hopefully. There you go. That's the only problem. Gotta shave the old arms now.